Okay, so timing is everything. And timing might appear to be working against Obama, at least compared to Franklin Roosevelt. So those are the three lessons. Now I'm going to look forward a little bit to 2012 and see whether the Roosevelt model might be recapitulated. I'm sure that the Obama White House hopes it is. As I said, Roosevelt was reelected in '36 with this huge majority. I think it's fair to say that if Obama is reelected in 2012, it's not going to be by a huge majority. However, if Roosevelt's experience in '36 isn't the best model, there are at least two, maybe three, other possible scenarios, possible precursors for figuring out what's going to happen in 2012. One possible outcome, and I'm sure the Obama administration people in the White House are paying close attention to this one, is Harry Truman. Harry Truman found himself after the congressional elections of 1946 in a situation very much like the one Obama faces now. The 46 elections were a disaster for the Democrats. The Democrats had controlled Congress since Roosevelt was elected in 1932. But after the Depression, after the war, and, this is critical, amid a post-war recession, voters turned against the Democrats and handed Congress to the Republicans. So it looked as though the Republicans were itching to regain the White House. They paid very little attention to any kind of positive agenda between 46 and 48. They decided that they were going to focus all of their efforts on claiming the White House in 48. With the result that Harry Truman, who was fully expected to lose in 48, was able to campaign in 48 against what he called the do-nothing Congress. And that, combined with the fact that the economy did perk up between 46 and 48, allowed Truman to slip into the White House in a great upset. So, in certain respects, Obama might be better placed today, actually, than he was 2 weeks ago. Because 2 weeks ago, he and the Democrats had to bear all of the blame for, or at least that voters would contend they had to bear all the blame for the sad condition the economy is in. Now that the Republicans control, at least will control the House, the Republicans are part of the government. And if they insist on obstructing, then Obama can run against them. But of course, the other half of the equation is the imponderable. If the economy improves between now and 2012, it's got to improve enough so that people will feel that things are getting better. But if that's the case, then that's a scenario that might get Obama elected in 2012. Another possible scenario, we'll see if, and this is more under the control of the president, is what Bill Clinton did after the '94 elections, where he did, I won't say an about-face, but at least a 90-degree turn. You remember in '93, upon his election, it was all about health care reform. And he governed as a liberal. After the '94 elections, he began talking about how the era of big government is over. And he moved hard to the center, and the Republicans overplayed their hand in '95 and '96. There was a showdown with the stoppage of the closing down of the federal government, which brought up one other thing that I haven't even said anything in particular about, and that is the likability quotient. The reason that Bill Clinton came out better in that showdown with Congress over shutting down the government was Bill Clinton was simply more likable than Newt Gingrich. And it's hard to know why that should matter as much as it does, but it does. But we'll think about it for a minute. Elections are at rock bottom popularity contests. And if somebody is likable, if somebody is charismatic, that can get them a lot of votes they wouldn't get otherwise. Okay, so that's a possible scenario. And certainly there are people suggesting to President Obama that he needs to move to the center and take a lesson from these elections. The voters were saying, we don't like your policy, so refashion yourself and then you have a chance to get reelected. Now the third scenario, and this is one presumably that folks in the White House don't particularly like, but it's entirely possible that President Obama could live with this, and that is the elder George Bush. The elder George Bush, one of the principal reasons that he did not get reelected in '92 was that he did what I think was a very principled thing. He went back on his pledge. Remember the read my lips, no new taxes. He believed that addressing the deficit problem required a compromise. He might be of that last generation, I don't know, but one of that generation of political leaders who realized that democracy is about not getting everything you want, but getting the best you can and acknowledging that those other people, they got elected too. And so you're going to have to come up with something that everybody, the majority at least, can live with. And so he cut a deal on the budget that, well, what did it do? It outraged Republican conservatives, it invited Ross Perot into the race, and it doomed his campaign for re-election. However, I fully believe, I believe that he considered it was the right thing to do. I think it was the right thing to do. It was good for the country. It was bad for his political future. It may well be that Barack Obama would decide he'll stick to his guns. He will do the principled thing, even if it makes him simply a one-term president. So we'll have to see about that. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'd be happy to take questions.
One of the things that I think is confusing to a lot of people, and people mislook at it, the notion that Obama had something like what Franklin Roosevelt had, of one-party control, and that notion that it ignores this historic thing that we've seen over 40 years because of the oddity of the Democratic Party and our Big Tent sense of things. First with Southern conservative Democrats, then they've disappeared over the last 30 years. But then what you had was this thing called Blue Dog people, and that the notion that he had a working majority, as Franklin Roosevelt really did with what you describe as a rubber stamping, is simply a misunderstanding of American politics and where we are. The reality is that the political spectrum has shifted, and that the Democratic Party being fractured in a way that the Republican Party is not, is something that did not give him, it was as if he had a 1946 or a 1994 Congress to deal with, because he could not simply get any policy that he wanted through the Congress.
You're absolutely right. The comment here is that President Obama has nothing like the freedom in dealing with Congress that Franklin Roosevelt had, and that is absolutely true. Roosevelt had, well, veto proof doesn't really apply here because of the same party, but he had overwhelming majorities in Congress. He could simply, when I said he went after Republican leadership, he didn't need a single Republican vote. He could get everything he wanted with just the Democrats. Things have changed. Barack Obama, first of all, didn't have that kind of majority. Secondly, between Roosevelt's day and this, in the Senate there has been a redefinition of what constitutes a filibuster. In the old days, you actually used to have to filibuster. You used to have to stand up and talk and talk and talk. As a result, the filibuster was used rarely. And so if you had a 10-vote majority in the Senate, that would have been, if you had a 5-vote majority in the Senate, that would have sufficed. The other thing was that in Roosevelt's day, and this didn't really apply early on, it would later, especially when it comes to war measures, Roosevelt lived in the time when bipartisanship was possible. And bipartisanship was possible until about the early 1970s, because both political parties contained substantial numbers of both conservatives and liberals. In the Democratic Party, for example, the Democratic Party had a very large southern wing. And that southern wing, these white Southerners, were almost all conservatives. And those conservative Southerners were to the right of half of the Republican Party in the day. And by the same token, the Republican Party included a lot of Northeastern and Upper Midwest liberals. So that, I mean, if we go from Franklin Roosevelt's day to Lyndon Johnson's day in the 1960s, and some of Lyndon Johnson's landmark civil rights reforms were passed with substantial Republican votes. And this was because these people believed the same thing that Johnson did. Now, largely as a consequence of what Johnson did, attaching the Democratic Party to the reforms of civil rights, he gave those conservative white Southerners permission to leave the party of their grandfathers. All those Southerners were Democrats because that was the party that opposed Lincoln and the War for the Union and Reconstruction. It's not because they believed what the rest of the Democrats believed, it was this historic thing. And when Johnson said the Democrats are now going to be the party of civil rights, they said, we're leaving. And the result of this was that the two parties over the next 20 years sifted themselves out ideologically. Johnson knew this was going to happen. Johnson, on the night he signed the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, told his secretary, his personal secretary, Bill Moyers, he said, Bill, I've just delivered the South to the Republican Party for the next generation. In fact, he underestimated it. It's, as far as one can tell, permanently. But the result now is that, in essence, there aren't any liberals in the Republican Party. And there aren't any real hardcore conservatives in the Democratic Party. It's fair to say that the entire Republican Party is to the right of the entire Democratic Party. It used to be there was a lot of overlap between the two. Anyway, very good question, good point. Yes, next question. Yes, please, in the back.
What do you, as we kind of gear towards 2012, the election moving forward,
I'd be interested in hearing, what do you think top 3 topics will be from now until 2012, and how do you think the Republican Party should mobilize and think about, what do you think their strategy should be as they prepare for the election?
As to what the Republican Party position should be preparing for the election, it really depends on what the Republican leadership considers their principal goals to be. And if the principal goal is, as some party leaders have suggested, reclaiming the White House, then that would advocate certain positions. If their goal is to start now on addressing the deficit, on forging some kind of compromise that the country can live with, because it seems to me anyway that if the deficit, if other long-term issues, Social Security, Medicare, you name it, if there's going to be any kind of progress in those, it's going to come by some sort of compromise. Neither party is going to get all that it wants. So if the Republicans want to start on that now, then they might well go to the table and say to the president, what can we do? What can we talk about? What can we agree on? But there will be a strong part of the party that will say, don't do that, because you'll simply be playing into his hands. If you give the president anything that he can take to the polls in 2012 and cite as an accomplishment or victory, then you're making it harder for us to win. So there would be the one called the Leninist school of thought in the Republican Party, where the worse things get, the better they are for our chances. So I don't know exactly, I don't know which position they're going to take. And of course, they've got to deal with the Tea Party, and nobody knows exactly what that's going to do. Nobody knows if they supported the Republican Party this time around. Will they continue to support the Republican Party if those Tea Party candidates get in and act like they really are going to govern the place instead of blow the place up? I don't know. But the principle, you asked for the 3 principal issues in the campaign of 2012. If you ask me, they're going to be the economy, and the economy. And if things are getting better, then I'm going to say Obama wins. If things remain as they are or get worse, he's going to lose. Now, I haven't said anything yet about who the Republican candidate might be. That will be important. But I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I'm going to tell you who the Republican nominee is going to be. Not because I'm rooting for him, but because I think he is the one who is going to kind of come from behind and position himself. And that is the recently re-elected, for the 3rd time, governor of Texas, Rick Perry. He is out on, he's on a book tour, but he's positioned himself very well. He is, first of all, the longest serving governor of the 2nd largest and most Republican state in the country. So he's got the experience. He's not somebody who just dropped in, who emerged from the Tea Party. He is, and comparing him, let's say, to Sarah Palin, he's really got the chops as running someplace big for a long period of time. He is a favorite of conservatives, and he is an exceedingly shrewd politician. He knows how to present himself to different groups. I'll give you one example of this. There is, in the state where I live and have lived for the last 25 years, Texas, there is a sort of crypto-secessionist movement for reasons that escape me, there are a lot of Texans who believe that the joint resolution of 1845, by which Texas was annexed to the Union, included an escape clause that said if Texas changes its mind, it can leave. And I can show this to my students. There it is. Find it for me. Is it written in invisible ink or something? And you can say this all you want, but there is a belief that either this exists or it ought to exist. And Perry knows how to talk to that group. Now, he maybe overstepped just a little bit several months ago when he addressed an openly, well, I don't know exactly how serious they are, but a group of Texas secessionists, as they call them. And he seemed to be endorsing their position. But when that raised a ruckus, he quickly backed off. And he explained that that's not what he said. No, Texas is firmly a part of this great United States. And anyway, so you heard it here first. Yes, sir.
Hello. As we all know, the president recently embarked on a trip to Asia, shall we say, and it's costing $200 million a day. I know this because I heard it.
Oh, okay, good.
I know this because I heard it.
Yes, yes, you're right.
And on Fox News. And I wanted to find out if you could address, just as President Roosevelt had his fireside chats, and how this was, as you suggest, something unprecedented really at the time. Is there a response to what I'll call the Foxification of the news cycle?
Boy, if I had the answer to that, I could probably get a job as White House Communications Director tomorrow. It's a tough one. I think that there are people in the room, including my son-in-law, who are better at this than I am, who know about public relations communications. But what the White House has done is to try to get right into the same news cycle and answer right away. And so, you get your side out. Lyndon Johnson was an expert at this kind of thing. He knew how the news cycles worked, and he knew how you had to get it in the same paper, what you had to do to get it in the same paper, and when you could announce something so that the other side wouldn't be able to get it in the same paper. I don't know if how tractable the problem is at all these days, but I will actually respond to something where I thought you were going to go, since you mentioned President Obama's Asia trip. Maybe curiously, for a lecture sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association. I haven't said anything about foreign policy. But I will tell you that Franklin Roosevelt did his best to avoid foreign policy during his first term for two reasons. One is that he knew that foreign policy did not play well when the country was in a depression. Americans did not want to see their president spending a lot of time dealing with foreigners when he should have been dealing with Americans. So there was this public relations aspect to it. But he also made a decision that he was going to address the crisis of the Depression from an essentially unilateral standpoint. He didn't want to get tied into any kind of currency agreement. In the summer of 1933, the major nations of the world, basically all the independent nations of the world, met in London for what was called the International Monetary and Economic Conference. It had been delayed several times precisely to allow American participation. In fact, it had been scheduled for the spring, but Roosevelt said, I can't participate, I've got this special session in Congress. So they moved it back and back and back until Roosevelt sent the 100 Days Congress home. And then they convened. And they fully expected the participation of Franklin Roosevelt and the American government, because Roosevelt had led them to believe, yes, okay, we do need to attack this global depression globally. But when Roosevelt watched the way the exchange rates were moving, when he saw that there was a positive response in the American economy to the 100 Days reforms, he decided he didn't want to get locked into anything at all. And while everybody was waiting for the president to weigh in, he changed his mind. And he gave this, a very short, actually a written message that in effect blew up the conference. And it sent the leadership of France and England and everybody else, they were to gnashing their teeth and, oh my God, how could the president do this? Ramsay MacDonald, who was the Prime Minister of England, was described, he was a broken man after this. He had been relying on Roosevelt to help cure the Depression. Roosevelt said, no, I'm not going to do it. I said there were two reasons. I'll give you the third reason. The third reason was Americans were overwhelmingly isolationist at the time. There was a feeling after the First World War that the U.S. got suckered into pulling Britain and France's chestnuts out of the fire. And Americans, for the most part, wanted to have nothing to do with the rest of the world. Now, it has been Barack Obama's good luck, I think, that so far in his first term, there have not been any huge foreign policy crises. He's had to deal with the two wars that he inherited. Now, the war in Iraq is going according to plan. The war in Afghanistan, I read Obama's policies regarding Afghanistan in much the way that I have interpreted Lyndon Johnson's policies toward Vietnam. And this is not necessarily a good sign. Johnson chose the policies he did toward Vietnam because he wanted to prevent Vietnam from becoming a big issue during his first term. He didn't give the generals all that they wanted. He didn't proclaim this to be an all-out war. He didn't call up the reserves because he knew that once Congress started debating the war, they would stop debating civil rights in the Great Society. On the other hand, he didn't pull out of Vietnam because he knew that that would set off the conservative Republicans who would blame him for losing Vietnam. So he chose the middle course. And I happen to think that that's the course that Obama has chosen in Afghanistan. And I'm not at all sure that he's going to have any more luck in Afghanistan than Johnson had in Vietnam. But it's really a way of kicking the can a little bit farther down the road, hoping to get the reforms that he wants in his first term passed, and then deal with Afghanistan later. Now, we will see. In Roosevelt's day, there were few issues from international affairs that could have forced a president to pay attention. There are lots of issues today that could, in foreign policy, that could force a president to pay attention. And I was going to say, I did say that it has mostly been Obama's good fortune not to have to deal with those. But I'll add one caveat to that, or one exception to that, and that is that it was precisely foreign crises that ultimately saved Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. Roosevelt, I told you, Roosevelt was reelected overwhelmingly in 1936. But by as 1940 was approaching, the country had fallen back into the Depression. There was a very sharp recession in 1937, which undid nearly all the gains of the previous 4 years. And as Roosevelt was looking toward 1940, first of all, there was that Washingtonian, George Washingtonian precedent against a third term. And secondly, even if that hadn't been in place, nobody was going to re-elect him. Because the one thing that he had been elected to do, he hadn't accomplished. He had not pulled the country out of the Depression. And 7 years into the Depression, well, 7 years into his presidency, 9 years into the Depression, Americans were fed up with it. The one thing that allowed Roosevelt to run for re-election in 1940 was the outbreak of war in Europe and the threat of war in Asia. So Roosevelt was able to position himself as the experienced leader and the one who was needed at the helm to guide the country through these turbulent, dangerous times. He was re-elected in 1940. And the result of this, or two results of this. Number one was he got the chance to be a wartime leader. He got a chance to be that leader that Theodore Roosevelt never became. But secondly, when federal spending on the war pulled the country out of the Depression, he and the New Deal got a sort of ex post facto approval, ex post facto credit for having pulled the country out of the Depression. It wasn't the New Deal that did it, but Roosevelt could say, well, I guess he couldn't say exactly I did it, but at least I was president when it happened. So by the end of Roosevelt's life, at the end of his presidency in April 1945, he could point to two enormously positive accomplishments. Number one, ending the Depression. Number two, saving democracy. Well, you can hardly beat that. Do we have time for, wait, are we done? Yeah, Bill.
Do you think that racism is a factor in Obama's problems in leadership?
I think racism is a consideration for some people. Is it a problem? The way I look at it is this. and I'll tell you, that there are almost certainly people who voted against Barack Obama because he's a black man. And there are probably almost certainly people who oppose his policies because he's a black man. On the other hand, there are almost certainly people who voted for Barack Obama because he's a black man. And there are almost certainly people who support his policies because he's a black man. I don't know how that balances out. And although race, of course, is a more salient and controversial characteristic in politics and a lot of other things, you can say the same thing about every president. If it had been Hillary Clinton, how many people voted against her because she was a woman? How many people would have voted for her because she was a woman? If, with John Kennedy in 1960, how many people voted against him because he was a Catholic? How many people voted for him because he was Catholic? Now, unless you do some really fine-tuned polling, it's pretty hard to tell. And in general, I just say that every candidate brings to the positions they get elected to a combination of characteristics, experiences, and traits. And you kind of have to take them one by one. So I don't have a good answer to that question. Yes, sir?
How would you compare the treatment in dealing with financial crisis between Roosevelt in 1933 and Obama since he's been president? You mentioned the bank holiday a day after he was inaugurated, or a couple days. Then there was the Securities Acts of 1933, 1934, which made a dramatic split in the banking system, which was a system that endured for 60 years afterwards. Obama, by comparison, inherited a financial, not a depression, but certainly a crisis, and then within 2 months moved to health care, spent a year on health care, during which I think a great part of his mandate dissipated, and then came up with what seems to be a watered-down Financial Regulation Act without dramatic structural change, but a long series of regulations which need to be drafted, and have created what seems to me uncertainty.
Yeah, I think there's a striking difference between Franklin Roosevelt's handling of the financial crisis of his time and Barack Obama's handling of the recent and ongoing financial crisis. And it gets to exactly what you said. Roosevelt took the opportunity of the crisis to restructure American finance. Obama, now in part because Obama still had to deal with the developing crisis, he felt less free, and he felt, for one reason or another, that he had to work with Wall Street rather than against Wall Street to the degree that Roosevelt did. But the result is that the financial industry in this country looks a whole lot like it did in 2007. There are plenty of people in this room who are better equipped to address that than I am. But there's been nothing like the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's nothing like the separation of investment from commercial banking. There's not even anything like FDIC. One of the striking differences between the banking crisis of 1933 and the banking crisis of 2008 was that the banking crisis of 1933 was one that afflicted millions of Americans directly. Bank depositors lost their shares, lost their life savings, because when the banks folded, the depositors had no protection. The banking crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, was one in which shareholders took a beating, but depositors didn't lose a nickel. And that's precisely...
Housing was affected.
Oh, housing certainly was. And housing was affected during the 1930s as well. And I won't call that a separate issue, but yeah. So I sort of naively assumed that when Obama became president, there was going to be some strong effort to enact structural changes. And they haven't happened yet. We've got a bill, but nobody knows exactly. We've got a law, but we don't know how it's going to take shape until the hundreds of regulations are actually figured out. So, and sometimes it seems to me that there's nothing but painful memory, and memories fade, that stand between us and a repetition of what happened in 2008. There's certainly nothing like the structural barriers that were put in place during the New Deal.
Can we give the last question to Dan Rose?
Please, yes, sir.
Are there any dramatic gestures that Barack Obama could take to restore the confidence of the public in his ability to lead?
Oh boy, good question. What could Obama do to restore the confidence of the public in his ability to lead? I'm going to tell you something that is going to sound a little bit cynical, but it works every time. And that is for the country to get attacked. If every time America gets attacked, there is a rally round the flag, which means rally round the president effect. Now, I certainly am not going to recommend that he start a war or arrange for the United States to get attacked by a sovereign power or terrorists. But that's the one thing that I can suggest that history says that would, and this would be even if he didn't do anything. Just the mere fact that if the country is under attack, people have to look to leadership. Remember the bounce that George W. Bush got after 9/11. The tragedy of 9/11 nonetheless caused his political stock to rise dramatically. Absent that, it's really hard to say. And I will say it's almost impossible because presidents, with the partial exception of Bill Clinton, who is something of a chameleon, presidents don't remake themselves halfway into their term. I think that the Obama we've seen is the Obama we're going to get. When one of the things that made Franklin Roosevelt's constant attack against his enemies work was that Roosevelt could get angry effectively in public. It was part genuine, it was part an act. Franklin Roosevelt once told Orson Welles, when the two of them met, the great director and actor, he said, "Orson, you and I are the two finest actors in America." And Roosevelt understood that part of being a president is knowing how to act the part. Obama clearly has a grasp of the policies. He clearly understands what the long-term challenges facing the country are. So far, he has not been able to inspire the American people the way Roosevelt did during the New Deal and during wartime, the way some other presidents have. And I don't know if that's something you can learn on the job. Thank you very much.